Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today we visit Lesson 18 of the Advanced Psychiana course written by Dr. Frank B. Robinson. So far in the first 17 lessons, we've learned so much, recently expanding our understandings, moving from unseen forces into the idea that you are life. Today, Robinson tries to transcend the materialist idea of manifestation and go into the spiritual. Lesson 18, Beyond Material Manifestation. Dear friend and student, you will find this 18th lesson entirely different from those that have gone before, and in a way, this is rather a distasteful lesson in parts. But in handling the truth as it exists, I must stay close by that truth and not allow sentiment to swing me at all. You will find also some very beautiful instructions and a beautiful spiritual sentiment running through this lesson. And I want you to apply this principle every day in your own life. For to find the power of the great God law means supreme happiness, supreme peace, and supreme supply. Sincerely, your friend and teacher, Frank B. Robinson. The lessons in this course, which you have received to date, have been specifically designed and very earnestly designed to show you something of the existence of this great unseen power we sometimes chose to call God. I have shown you scientifically that there does exist an unseen dynamic spiritual power, and I have further shown you that this power does not, and indeed could not, operate through any one man or any one organization to the exclusion of the rest of the human race. I have so earnestly tried to show you your universality and omnipotence and the omniscience and everywhereness of this great invisible but dynamic power. I have shown you furthermore that this power is a law, a spiritual law, which must respond and which does respond universally and in every individual case in which the conditions of this law are complied with. I realize that the common opinion of perhaps 99% of the human race is that financial and material success are the only things necessary to complete happiness in life. I realize that this is perhaps the universally held opinion of practically everybody, so in this course of instruction so far, I have carefully and purposely designed these lessons to show you how this great God law can be used for the manifestation of these material things. I have shown you, however, that the source of every material manifestation must lie and does lie in the great unseen spiritual cosmic God realm. In that realm lies the starting point and very beginning of every physical and material thing on this earth. We covered that rather carefully in the lesson dealing with that subject, and I think you will realize that without the unseen creative realm of the God law, there never could have been any material or physical manifestation of any kind. Nor could there have been any physical manifestation of life as we know it in all its varied forms. I took great pains to impress this fact upon you, and right here I want to drive it home again. I want you to permanently understand that the origin of every created thing lies in the unseen creative spiritual realm of this dynamic spiritual power we call God. I want you to further understand that whatever material things manifest in your own individual life in the future will first have a manifestation unseen by you in your thought realm, which, as you know, is a definite part of the great universal spiritual realm of the great life spirit. Most of my students are absolutely in earnest in desiring the better things of life, and by far the great majority of them are following me very closely and are day by day and week by week, and month by month, laying the foundation in the spiritual realm, or rather, let me say, they are making the manifestation in the spiritual realm of those things which are to manifest materially or physically in due time. Many of these good friends and students of mine, in fact, quite a large percentage of them, have already written to me thanking me for leading them to the place in which they could actually manifest the blessings and the power of this great God realm. These thousands of letters to me and to anyone else are conclusive evidence of the truth and reality of the power of the great God law, which actually brings into realization by means of the unseen spiritual realm the things needed and desired physically and materially here and now. But there is another side to this question of manifestation, and while it is a fact that the vast majority of people imagine that happiness, success, and satisfaction lie in the material realm and in material possessions, let me say to my students that money or material possessions never yet were the means to the very best things the spiritual realm holds for you and for me. There is no question whatsoever that money and a nice home and a good car are very much to be desired blessings in many cases. But the point I want to make is that the obtaining of these things is by no means an assurance of real happiness, real satisfaction, or real success in life. For real success in life lies not so much in getting as in giving. Real satisfaction in life lies not so much in material accumulation as it lies in the accumulation of the finer spiritual things of life. And real happiness in life lies not so much in the amassing of a fortune as it does lie in the fact of the conscious realization of one's inseparableness from the vast spiritual God realm. So in this lesson, we are going to get away from the material realm for a while, and I'm going to show you some of the finer and much more to be desired gifts that this invisible spiritual realm bestows upon those in that realm, and which gifts are a part of this great God law itself. I have purposely given the impression in this course of instruction so far that the spiritual God law is a cold-blooded, never-varying law, working with absolute precision and with certainty of a chemical formula whenever the conditions governing this law are complied with. I've deliberately done this, for that is actually the impression I wanted you to form. I wanted you to have a conception of spiritual law which would convince you beyond the shadow of a doubt there is no possibility of spiritual law failing when the conditions governing it are complied with. So in order to more effectively do this, I have impressed upon your minds the fact, and it is a fact, there is no more possible way to miss the results from this great realm of spiritual law than there is to stop a pencil from dropping to the floor by the law of gravitation. I've used my best brain power and my most earnest efforts in my attempt to give you this picture of this great God realm, and right here I wish to make it even stronger if I possibly can. When dealing with the God realm, there can be no such thing as a petitioning this great realm for something, and then hopefully and watchfully waiting in the expectation of the power behind the spiritual realm, looking with favor upon your request, and some time or other in the far distant future perhaps granting it. This is the common idea given out by the religious systems of the day. If adversity comes along, you are told that it is all in the will of God, and you must not murmur or complain, but just simply say in a very meek and obedient voice, "Though dark my path and sad my lot, let me be still and murmur not, but breathe the prayer divinely taught, thy will be done. What though in lonely grief I sigh, for friends beloved no longer nigh, submissive still would I reply, thy will be done." This sentiment is a million miles from the truth of God as it actually exists. The sentiment behind this teaching, however, is easily understood when it is traced back to its source. In those days, the church was what it would like to be now, but cannot, a great political power. Every means were used to cow people into submission, and threats of hell and damnation and everything else were held over their heads in an effort, and very vain effort, by the way, to force this foolish and pagan teaching into the minds of ignorant and superstitious people, incapable of thinking for themselves. In those days, the world was a very fertile field for all sorts of religious superstition, and many and terrible were the atrocities committed in the name of God. A few weeks ago, I was in New York City and made a special trip to see one of the most gruesome exhibitions I have ever seen in my life. It was interesting, but I never want to see it again. Mr. Joseph Lewis has brought to this country direct from Germany several dozens of instruments of torture, which were used by the so-called Christian church only a few hundred years ago, in its effort to force down the throats of the heretics, or in other words, those who believe differently, the teachings of that religious organization. The first thing I saw in this exhibition room were several pairs of horrible pincers, 2 or 3 feet long, with which the tongues of these heretics were literally torn out of the roots. Following after this, I saw another gruesome display of gouges by which the eyes of the non-Christians were literally gouged out in the name of God by a supposedly Christian organization, Over in one corner of the exhibition room was a rack, which was a horrible piece of machinery. The victim was fastened down on this rack and both arms extended over his head and chained to a post on the two upper corners of this diabolical instrument of torture. The legs were also extended and similarly fastened. Then 2 men or more would get on a wheel and turn it until the victim's arms and legs were torn from their sockets. The next gem in the Christian persuasive category was a bathtub sitting on rockers. It was about 6 feet long and made of wool with sloping sides and ends, with points only 1/2 inch apart. Horrible steel spikes about 1.5 inches long were driven into the bathtub, and these points sharpened to points of terrible cruelty. The victim, stark naked, was put into this bathtub and rocked from side to side, and you can imagine the conditions of this unbeliever when these cruel and ignorant and benighted agents of God were through with him or her. Or a table in the center of the exhibition hall were several branding irons for the purpose of branding unbelievers on the forehead and other parts of the body as a punishment for their not believing in the God taught by this holy religious organization. On still another table was a gruesome assortment of thumb screws which were fastened around the wrists of the victim, and his thumb screwed around and around until it was literally wrenched from his body. Another horrible thing I saw was the wheel in the rack. This consisted of a ladder about 7 feet long and 2 feet wide, constructed of very heavy wood with rungs about 6 inches apart and having sharp edges on them. The victim was tied to this rack, and the holy men of God, attempting to convert him, seized a very heavy wheel. On this wheel, a knife blade about 6 inches deep and 1 foot long had been fastened, and while this helpless victim lay tied to the rack, these saints would bring down the wheel with the knife blade attached onto his body until he was literally hacked into pieces. There was also a terrible chair where the seat of which was covered with 1.5 inch spikes also were the back and the arms. The unsaved one was compelled to sit in this chair, stark naked on these spikes, and then was chained in that condition. One of the most fiendish things, though, was a brass helmet which was fitted over the head of the unbeliever, and on each side of this helmet was a funnel-shaped affair hollow on the inside. Molten lead was then poured through these funnel-shaped affairs after this horrible thing was attached over the sinner's head, and this molten lead ran into the ears and down the sides of the face of the victim. I saw in that horrible place mouth gags were pear-shaped, which were forced into the mouth and then screwed wide open. Lying in another corner of the room were several torture belts, which were applied to the naked bodies of women. As long as the victim stood absolutely motionless, she suffered no pain. At the very moment she made one move, then spikes from this torture belt penetrated her flesh. Several whips were with many lashes onto which pieces of lead with jagged points had been fastened every 6 or 8 inches, and the victim was horribly lashed to death or to insensibility. But the crowning masterpiece of all was a contraption called the Iron Maiden. This is a hollow brass figure of a woman hinged on one side and weighing several tons. The unbeliever was placed upright in this contraption, and the door was forced shut. On the inside of the door were spikes 6 inches long and fixed in such a manner that when the door was closed, the victim was impaled by these spikes and suffered an excruciating and agonizing death. With devilish ingenuity, 2 of these spikes were placed so that they went through the eyes, another penetrated the nose, while another went through the mouth, 3 went through the breast, 2 through the stomach, and 4 through each leg. I will not prolong this picture, for I realize as well as you do that this is a horrible thing to talk and write about. My only object in mentioning these terrible things I saw in New York is to make a definite connection between them and the teaching I have just alluded to, which tries to tell thinking, intelligent men and women today they must keep submissive to the will of God. This submission teaching originated in the countries and by the organizations which used the cruel methods I have described to force men and women to accept their religious teaching, and this teaching of submission to both God and his agents was the fundamental feature and dogma of that horrible thing which masqueraded as a divinely appointed organization to which the truths of the great God had been exclusively revealed. Now that connection is established, and now that it has been clearly shown that this petitioning of God is a false and pagan teaching, let us forget this picture and view another, which is more sensible and reasonable one of the operation of the great spiritual God realm in a human life. While I was very insistent upon painting this picture of the spiritual realm as being an immutable realm of law, I purposely left until this part of the course another side of this realm, which operates with the same unerring accuracy and precision in the unseen spiritual realm as it does in the physical and material realm. For instance, I would not for one moment have my students think that all the realm of God is an invisible storehouse from which, by complying with an immutable law, they might obtain whatever natural things they might need for their happiness. These material things positively are to be obtained from this great God realm, but also there is to be obtained from this same realm many unseen and therefore spiritual gifts, and it is of these gifts that I want to write for a little while now. Here is a student. He grasps the law governing this great spiritual realm. He applies the law and is eminently satisfied in a material way. But he may not stop there, and if he does, disappointment and unhappiness and failure are almost sure to follow, because he has not gone the limit in appropriating to himself all that the spiritual God realm has to give. For there is in that realm much more than physical and material wealth. And let me repeat, I question very much whether the accumulation of material things can ever bring permanent, lasting joy and happiness, because such happiness and joy may not be found merely in the possession of material things. When my students have learned something of the existent power of the God realm, and something of the existent presence of this great creative God law, the first thing they are able to experience is a strange spiritual quietness which goes far beyond the so-called joy and happiness which may or may not come from the possession of material things. Some poet said joy is like restless days, but peace divine like quiet night. And by far the greatest gift attached to the realm of God, or perhaps I should say the greatest attribute of the law of God, is the attribute of peace. Just as surely as the great God law brings this health and happiness and success materially, it also brings this spiritual peace. Let me take one specific example, which is perhaps characteristic of thousands I know. Here is a student. He has been suffering perhaps from some minor ailment or affliction. He comes into contact with the great God law, and by complying with the conditions underlying or governing this God law, he secures freedom from this condition. Then he masters his material surroundings and perhaps obtains a good paying position, or as one student wrote me this morning, I've made the first payment on a new home. He accumulates a little money in the bank and is well on the road to material success through the application of this invisible God law. And here's where I want to warn you to be very, very careful. For if you stop at this point, you will miss the goal, and you will find that you have before you a life of continual struggle and continual restlessness and continual anxiety, for you will be limited in your use of the spiritual realm to material things, and therefore will miss the true source of the power which naturally emanates from this great creative God realm. You will find as you progress in this realm of God that the master key, which unlocks all the other locks in this great mansion, may be called the key of peace. Perhaps trust could be a better name for it. You see, if I trust a person, then I am absolutely at ease in his presence. I can talk freely before him, and I can also act freely. No question ever arises as to my being refused any request I might make of him, and therefore any worry or fretfulness cannot possibly enter into a situation where two people trust each other. I want you to enter into this arrangement, if you please, with the great God law. I want you to recognize that you, yourself, through your oneness with the great spiritual power, have in you all the power that is tied up in this great spiritual realm, and that is certainly sufficient power to make you an overcomer in every phase of life. I want you to realize that as this great God law is a creative law, so are you. As part of this great God law, also a creative being. You cannot stay in communion with the spiritual realm and not yourself be a creator, for the Spirit of God will drive you to the creation of something or other. In my own particular case, it drove me to the creation of this marvelous work of mine. In your case, it may drive you to the creation of something along an entirely different line. This great God law drove Thomas A. Edison into his marvelous inventions. The same great God law drove Henry Ford along the lines of mechanical genius. The same great spiritual law is driving everyone in its power toward a creative end of some sort or other. Some people do not allow their reason to reign supreme, and therefore they allow this great law to drive them in the wrong direction, in which case they inevitably meet with disaster and failure. For the same great law, which will drive me to create a movement which will change the lives of thousands, will also operate with the same unerring accuracy and precision to the destruction of a man, if he does not stay close to the law and follow the greatest gift of the law, that gift being the purest gem in the human mind, the gem of reason. Not long ago, I personally listened to a famous preacher. There is no question in my mind the man is being driven by the great God Spirit, but this particular man is allowing himself to be driven according to old pagan dogmas and doctrines, which on the very face of them are so asinine and so foolish that a child with its pureness of heart could not possibly believe them. Yet this man wonders why 80% of the churches in his denomination are not self-supporting. He wonders why he labors his heart out and as yet is a failure as far as actually doing anything for the human race is concerned. He cannot for the life of him see why nothing but failure, and worse than failure, seems to be ahead of his efforts, which he recognizes are controlled by the great God law. If this good brother would sit down and think for about a week and decide to discard everything unreasonable in his teachings, he would be one of the most stupendous leaders the world has ever seen. But he will not do this. Instead, he chooses to limit himself by applying the driving force of the great God Spirit along a channel which is based purely on a man-made and therefore perfectly human dogma and tradition. This man will tell you that he actually believes that the great creative intelligence of this universe came down to earth in mortal flesh and was born in that form through the medium of the wife of a Syrian Jew. He will tell you that he actually believes that through the crucifixion of this child of the Syrian Jewess, which child was at the same time God and man, he will tell you that he actually believes that by this barbarous act, those who believe this story shall be eternally saved from eternal damnation. Now I ask you if you think this is a reasonable belief. I ask you if you think this is a true belief, and your answer must be no to both questions. This being a fact, then the entire story must be and is entirely outside of the realm of the great God Spirit. There's no question at all in my mind that the story does belong in the Christian religion, for the simple reason the only God the Christian religion has ever known is the old Yahweh or Jehovah, which God never was anything more than the old tribal God of the Jews, and which God never had any existence outside the imagination of those old Jewish religious leaders. This is the God that smote dead over 50,000 men and women for attempting to look into a little wooden box called the Ark, in which this old God Yahweh or Jehovah lived. So I must, in honesty to myself and to say to you, that any teaching by any religious organization, no matter who they may be, must be false and untrue if it teaches anything contrary to illumined human reasoning. I have stated in many of my writings, and been grossly misunderstood for stating it, that the Christian religion as it exists today is founded wholly upon an unprovable fabrication, originating in a perfectly human but perfectly blind and ignorant superstitious structure, which structure, in its attempts to manufacture a guide of its own, stole a crucifixion and resurrection story from another system, which story was known to millions of people thousands of years before the so-called savior of this religion was ever heard of. You will never save this world, and you will never give to a human being one single enlightened and helpful thought from a system of religion which is based on fear and ignorance and superstition. What an atrocity it is to attempt to be a power for enlightenment in the world and come to the world with a story so foolish that even a child cannot believe it. The religious organizations of today are dabbling with prohibition. They're fighting amongst themselves. We have over 300 of them in this country, and outside of their social organization, they do not have among them one reasonable, sensible, constructive truth to give anybody. They had better leave prohibition and politics and everything else alone and examine their own structure first, and then, when convinced of its dishonesty, which they inevitably will be only a superficial examination, they had better come to men and women with a true story of a true God, which is not and cannot be Jehovah or old Yahweh, the tribal god of the Jews. What a difference in the life of a student of mine who knows some things of the freedom and something of the quietness and something of the power of the great creative God law behind this universe. There is no fear in the life of such a one, either of the past or of the future, for there is no fear in the realm of God. I promise you that. Instead of fear, there comes an absolute trust. Instead of doubt, there comes an absolute faith. And instead of strife and turmoil, there comes calm, for the realm of the Spirit of God is a realm of calm. It is a realm of peace. It is a realm of quietness. It is a realm of static power. And you can make it dynamic by applying it in your own life. Now, for the next 2 weeks, I want you to discontinue the use of all affirmations of every kind. And I want you to enter into a period of absolute quietness. I want this period to be with the full consciousness that this quietness comes to you from the spiritual realm, or rather is part of the spiritual realm. You see, you cannot hear the still small voice of the great life spirit unless you keep quiet. You could not hear a whisper at a ball game if your life is busy. If it is noisy, if it is hurried, and if it is fretful, you will not be able to hear this still small voice of God. When you arise in the morning, sit still for a few moments and be quiet. Recognize your union with the great life spirit. Take your bath quietly, dress quietly, eat your meals quietly, go to work quietly, do your daily duties quietly, and for the next 2 weeks, let there be a silence over your entire life. This is what will happen. Out of that quietness will come to you a knowledge of your union with the great God Spirit. You will know as never before something of the power that lies in the peace and quietness of God. You have a problem which needs solving. You will be much more able to get the solution of the problem in the quietness than you will be able to get it in the bluster and humdrum of life. If you're out of a job, if there are pressing bills to be met, if you do not know where the rent is coming from, or if you do not know where the next meal is coming from, or if you have domestic troubles, you will find the answer much more quickly through a simple, quiet resting in this great, quiet realm of God than you will in any other way. In fact, it is an immutable law of God that the answer to every human problem, and this includes yours, may be found in the great, quiet spiritual realm from whence comes all wisdom. You will be kind in this quiet realm. You will be loving in this quiet realm. You will say no unkind things or hurtful things to anyone, because you cannot if you keep quiet. Relax your efforts to direct your little bark on the sea of life. You have the coast clear for the master pilot to step aboard your little vessel and through you guide it aright. You will not be like the preacher I mentioned, driven in the wrong directions, but by living this quiet life, with nothing imposed by you between yourself and the great God Spirit, you will invariably and most assuredly be driven where you should go, for this master intelligence, this unseen God Spirit, is the cause of life. It caused your life to be. Consequently, it knows far better than you know in what channel lies complete happiness and success. You might, by being noisy and unsettled, do the very thing which will hinder your hearing the direct leadings from the great God Spirit. When this life is lived, you will find that there will be created in you a desire to pass on your knowledge of the great life spirit to others. This presence will become very close to you and very near to you, and in working with this spirit, you will find that it will show you the way to triumph over every undesirable condition. If you will live continually in this attitude toward the great God Spirit, you need have no more thoughts about your future, for you will want to follow where this great Spirit leads, and that is always aright. So for the next 2 weeks, and indeed forever, let this be your condition of life. There is a little poem which comes to mind, now written by the saintly old man, Dr. Washington Gladden, who, by the way, was ostracized by his own church organization and practically called a heretic and an infidel for stating that the Bible was not infallible. The precious old Bible scholar of the Congregational Church said, "In the Bible, human ignorance and error have been suffered to mingle with the stream of living water throughout all its course. If our assistance of salvation was made to depend upon our knowledge that every word in the Bible was of divine origin, our hope of eternal life would altogether be insecure. It is not infallible scientifically, it is not infallible historically, and it is not infallible morally, and the attempt of any intelligent man to maintain the theories and to maintain the infallibility of this book is a criminal blunder. For making that statement, this man was ostracized, and of course, the Congregational church to which he belonged stated he knew nothing about God at all. They bitterly condemned him and said all sorts of nasty things about him. But listen to what he wrote as I am about to quote it, and then ask yourself, who knew the most about God, the great life spirit, Dr. Washington Gladden, or the church founded upon pagan superstitions and idolatry which condemned him? I want you to read these verses slowly and carefully, and when the word master appears in these beautiful verses, you look upon that word as being the great invisible God Spirit. Do not consider for one moment that it means Jesus Christ or any other of the world's 16 crucified God-men. For the time being, at least just pass that out of the picture, and in repeating these marvelous verses, do so with the idea in mind that the word master means the great life spirit you are learning to know and to love. O Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free. Tell me thy secret, help me bear the strain of toil, the fret of care. Help me the slow of heart to move by some clear winning word of love. Teach me the wayward feet to stay and guide them in the homeward way. Teach me thy patience still with thee in closer, dear company. In work that keeps faith sweet and strong, in trust that triumphs over wrong, in hope that sends a shining ray far down the future's broadening way, in peace that only thou canst give. With thee, O Master, let me live. I'm going to leave you now with this thought, and I wish you the happiness that it brings me to know that thousands of students the world over will be reading these beautiful lines and will be quietly testing from now on in the peace and the power coming from the great spirit of the real God. Sincerely, your friend and teacher, Frank B. Robinson. Examination questions for lesson number 18. These examination questions are for your benefit, and you should know the answers to them all. If they're not clear to you, read your lesson again and again until they are clear. 1. Whatever material thing manifests in your own individual life in the future will have had a prior manifestation. 2. What constitutes A, real happiness, B, real satisfaction, and C, real success in life? 3. Distinguish between the common idea regarding prayer given out by existing religious systems and the attitude of one who uses the God law. 4. The fundamental policy of the church was expressed in the well-known hymn, Thy Will Be Done. 5. What was the reason for describing the various horrible instruments of torture exhibited in New York? 6. A student, by applying the God law, may be eminently satisfied in a material way, but he must not stop there. 7. What is described in this lesson as the greatest attribute of the law of God? 8. What is described as the master key which unlocks all other locks in the realm of God? 9. Why is it you are a creative being? 10. There exists a danger that as a creative being you may be driven in the wrong direction. How can this danger be avoided? 11. Why is it beneficial to enter into a period of absolute quietness? And 12. Why need you have no more thoughts about your future? This concludes Lesson 18 of the Psychiana series. We only have 2 more to go in this particular round of the Psychiana series, and it has been such a joy to read these, and it is really perfect to stretch them out every 2 weeks. At first I wanted to just read them all at one time, but I have found there's a certain seasoning this provides over a period of time. And this is a very important lesson that I think that everybody comes to spiritually, especially as they learn to test and experience the living God realm. You're going to have all of your material needs satisfied. You're going to have that house that you want, that car that you want, the perfect job. Everything that you ever wanted in the material world will come to you eventually. And there's going to be a point where you realize this is great, it's wonderful, I'm not undermining it, but still there's more. And you'll find your happiness that goes beyond these material things. There is an emphasis at the end of this lesson on the power of quietness, and it is so powerful. It's the stillness that Neville Goddard spoke about. There is So much that you can gain from this stillness. Once you begin to listen to the mighty life spirit, which is speaking to you often, and you hear the words that it whispers into your ear, you'll find your purpose. Everybody has a purpose, and once you realize that you've been created for a particular purpose, and you start to live this purpose out, it is a wonderful thing. These lessons really bring that about in you. I sure love everything that you have to say about Psychiana, good or bad. Please put it in the comments. I want to know how it's been going for you, if you've tried the exercises, if you've noticed the path that you've been on and the expansion that this has brought about. I would love to know more about your personal experiences with these lessons. In any case, you can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. You can find all lessons for this in the Psychiana playlist on my channel. Using this powerful God law, I am imagining the greatest of pleasure and love for every person that can hear the vibrations of my voice right now in this moment. A perfect life and a fantastic timeline now await. And welcome to the Reality Revolution.